Hi everyone, this is Stephanie Hawkins at Archive Social, and we're going to be getting started here in just a minute. Hi again, welcome. This is Stephanie Hawkins at Archive Social, and welcome everybody to our webinar on the Clerk's Guide to Social Media Record Keeping. We've got a really great webinar planned today. I'm really excited about it. So just a quick housekeeping slide. All attendees are on mute. Feel free to use the question function to submit questions. And to find where that is, you'll see you have a control panel for GoToWebinar. So go over onto the right and you'll see a panel for questions, and you can just type your questions in there and you can select them either to go to the group or just to the speakers, and we will see them. And there will be time for questions throughout and then also at the end. So feel free to type in your question whenever you think about it. But please do send your questions through, and as we have breaks, I can flag them. And then finally, the webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording via email. All right, great. So our speaker today is Anil Chawla, the founder and CEO of Archive Social. He is a national speaker and subject matter expert on legal, policy, and records management issues related to social media in government. So we're very excited to have him here today.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon or morning, depending on where you're located. We are very excited about this opportunity to collaborate with IAMC on this topic. And while we have the pleasure of virtually meeting you over this web conference today, wanted to also mention that we will be at the IAMC conference in May and look forward to meeting many of you there in person. And so to go ahead and get started with today's presentation around social media records and what clerks need to know, I wanted to share up front our plan for the overall session. And again, to reiterate what Stephanie said, we are taking questions. We are taking those questions throughout. So highly encourage you, as I go through these topics, encourage you to add questions to the Q&A window in GoToWebinar. We will take breaks throughout to see which questions have come in and address them as we go. And of course, we'll take time at the end for questions. But as a basic structure today, what we want to do is we want to start by talking about social media and its use in government. And right out the gate, address this issue of social media as a public record. So we will talk through the concepts of the public records law and how they apply to social media. We'll even look at some specific examples in states across the country. Then what I'd like to do is actually take that academic information from the law and make it real. We are going to go through some common scenarios. In fact, there's 3 areas where we have seen significant attention on social media as a record. And so in today's presentation, in our discussion here, we want to call out those areas. If they're not on your radar today, they should be, for you to understand where and how and why social media is requested as a record, and what that's meant for agencies that have dealt with those situations. And of course, the intent here is to arm you with the information to be proactive and to be able to protect your agencies. So after we go through those three key areas, and we'll have a lot of case studies and examples, we'll then transition to what can you do. And really that's our goal here today, is to arm you with not only the awareness, but the tactics and solutions for thinking about your social media as a record. There are different ways that you can approach this problem, but what's important is that you do take action on this. And really that's the hope of mine and all of us here at Archive Social, is regardless of how you do it, that you recognize the importance of social media as a record coming out of today's session, and you're able to take that first step towards protecting your agency if you haven't already done so. And again, we'll take questions throughout and have some time at the end. So to get started, before I get into the meat of the material on the public records law, the policy, the legal issues that hopefully those of you on the phone who do this for a living, as I do, that is information that we are passionate about. But when we talk about policy and legal issues, sometimes we forget about the why and why this matters in the first place. I did want to start out with why social media is so important and how impactful it has been for agencies across the country, and really how you fit in if you're a clerk or you're involved with records management for your organization, why this topic matters to you. And we have to acknowledge right out the gate that while if you're a clerk, you are the official keeper of records, you own that responsibility for ensuring transparency and upholding those obligations to the records requirements. You're probably not the person, you may be, but in many cases you're not the person directly managing your social media. And so there is this, as we have in government, this relationship with different stakeholders. And one thing that's become obvious to us is whether, again, you're a clerk or you're in legal, you may know the legal requirements and the policy requirements in and out, but you may not always be as aware of what exactly is happening on your social media. Now, hopefully that's changing, and I think it's changing because of how important social media has become to the agency. But we have found time and time with agencies that a communications line between you and communications is really important. And what we wanted to do out the gate here is really acknowledge how critical social media has become, because even in the last, I would say, 2 to 3 years, it has gone from, for many agencies, being one channel, one avenue for communication, to, in many cases, the most primary, the most important channel for communication. And so again, being able to draw the line between what's actually being created as a record, what's actually being communicated on something like Facebook or Twitter, is really important to then tie that back to the public records law and the policies that you're used to upholding. So we're going to help to understand that. We are going to, after talking about the positive here, and again, social media is so incredibly positive, we will spend a lot of time in this presentation today going through real case studies, legal examples. They can all sound a bit scary, but I wanted to start out with the reminder that the vast majority of the time, social media is important because it's so beneficial and so important to your agency. Now, I want to take a poll here. It's really important for me personally, as we go through this, to understand how you all currently view various issues, and we can spend some more time on issues that you respond to on these polls. So we'll start out with this poll about what aspect of your agency's social media policy do you wish you felt more confident about. And this poll should be on the screen for you now. You can respond in regards to public records laws, this issue of just responding to records requests, public records or not. And then also oversight. As I mentioned before, there can be these disconnects because there are different roles in government, but having that oversight is so important for you, especially over channels that have these critical communications. So we're going to give this just a few more moments. If you haven't responded already, we have, I think, a majority of the results have come in, and we'll go ahead and take a look at this. Great. So we have responses across the board. More than half of you wish you felt more confident about the public records laws and how they apply. So that's perfect. That is the topic that we'll start out with and dive deeply into to get going here. Records requests being a big issue. About a third of you responded. That being an area that you'd like to dive into. We will actually give you several examples of real records requests, situations where social media is being requested. And then we'll also touch on oversight as well. So thank you for those responses. And we'll go ahead and proceed into our first topic, which is around public records. And what I'll start out with is something that I imagine isn't surprising to any of you on the phone here who long fulfilled these responsibilities around records for your organization, is that your records laws, regardless of which state you're in, were written in a very broad fashion. They were written decades ago, but they were written in a very broad fashion that has really stood up to the test of time. And we have an example here from the state of California, the California Public Records Act. And we particularly pull this out because this definition of public records is something that's shared across most records laws in most states, writing related to the conduct of public business, prepared, generated, sent, owned, used, those are words we typically hear, and then received is often a word in these records laws. So essentially any communication in relation to your agency's business, related to the activities and efforts you have in conducting the business of your agency, regardless of physical form or characteristics, right? And that's the key phrase. So when these laws were written, of course, email wasn't around, but we've all, I think, now for a long time have come to the conclusion that email generates public records. And we've been in a similar boat with social media. So in 2009, 2010, there were some initial questions of, well, is social media a record? Well, if you go back to this law that's been there for a very long time, it meets this definition. And so today what we see across the United States, in every state, there is consensus that social media does fit this requirement just like any other form of communication. If you receive a crime tip, it's a crime tip on a piece of paper. In an email or a Twitter direct message, a crime tip is a crime tip regardless of physical form. And what's been really good, though, for those of you who are not aware, in your state, not only has this law been there, that's been this future-proof law that's applied to all the ways that you communicate, but your state has likely now, in the past few years, come out with additional guidance clarifying the application of this law. So if there is any confusion, if you are wondering, does this law really apply, it's likely that your state has come out with guidance. So again, here in California, in 2015, CalRIM, the California Records Information Management Program, came out with this guidance. It talks about how social media generates records, how the Public Records Act applies in California to social media, in what situations. And what's really key, though, is it also talks about how you need to have a plan. You need to have a plan to export those records from a social media site. You have to do something about this. It's not a matter of just acknowledging it's a record. You do need to take action. So we'll talk, of course, in depth about that later in this conversation. Wisconsin, just another example here, where the guidance came out in 2015. Again, similar to what we just saw with California. The authority should adopt procedures to retain and preserve such records. So again, not just acknowledging it's a record, but doing something about it. Massachusetts, the public entity is obligated to take affirmative steps to retain copies of social media posts. So you see where I'm going here. Each of the states have not only come out and acknowledged that this is a record, but has really provided some clear guidance to say, do something about this, take some action. And if you're wondering where you can find this type of guidance, I'm going to go back to this slide. We at Archive Social have taken the effort to, this is obviously the core of what we care about day in and day out, to consolidate the latest guidance, the official guidance from every state across the country. And so, in fact, if you go to this URL, bit.ly/SM Public Records, click on your state, and the latest guidance, and this is something that we stay on top of, the latest guidance that we've seen, just directly from your state, directly from the authorities in your state, all in one place for your state. So you can see exactly how your state and your state records bodies have been addressing this issue of social media as record. There are some nuances that we need to call out here that may not be obvious on first read when you look at the records law or you look at the guidance. The guidance is pretty clear, though, and I would encourage you to reread it after I go through the examples. It's not just about what your agency says. Of course, what you say can constitute public record, but the law is not just sent, it's sent and received. And what often gets missed by agencies is this notion that your citizens, when they comment to you or send you a message, post on your timeline, if you allow that, they're generating records too. And so you need to think about that, those sides of the conversation. Just like with email, when you receive emails, those emails that you receive from the public can constitute long-term public record. Again, not everything that's said on social media is a long-term record. The smiley face or the thanks or whatever else might get said, that may be of administrative value, but certainly in the mix of information, again, it could be something like a crime tip or a citizen complaint. That social media that's coming in constitutes record and can constitute long-term record. And not only do you want to have this for public record, by the way, and we'll look at some examples of this, it's good to have both sides of the story for a variety of reasons, and particularly if there's controversy or legal situations. And when you then acknowledge that the two sides of the conversation generate public record, the next thing to recognize is that you don't have control of both sides. So you can, of course, control what you post. You can decide if you want to hide or remove content from citizens, but you have to remember that they can also decide too what they want to do with what they've said. So a citizen can post a comment, again, maybe it's a crime tip, maybe it's a citizen complaint, maybe it's some other record of value, and then easily click delete and remove that. So this is really where the issue comes out of it not just being a record, you not just having to do something about it, but the challenge of doing something about it is that it's a two-way conversation and you don't have full control of it. Your citizens can't hit delete. With email, they can't hit undo after they sent you an email and take it back. It makes it a little easier, but with social media, they can. But you're still responsible for that record. Records generated at the time of creation, you received it, and then it can go away later. So I wanted to lay that out as the landscape of the requirements, how the states are looking at it, those key issues. And I'm going to pause here for just a moment to see if we have any questions. And it's looking like right now we haven't had many questions in. I'm hoping that most of you on the line, this is not terribly new to you, that this is something that you agree with. But if you don't agree, this is the forum. Please do raise your questions, raise your viewpoint on this. These are the conversations that we are here to have to help address the confusion. One of the things that we didn't mention up front, why we're doing this, we work with over 1,000 agencies across the country, government agencies, law enforcement, school districts. And so one of the most important responsibilities we feel we have is to channel what we see happening across the industry. So if you have a question, it's likely we've ran into it somewhere else, and we can certainly address that here. Okay, so I'm going to keep going now. I'm going to take it again from that academic view of social media as a record according to the law and start to bring in some of the reality and give you some concrete, specific examples where social media generates records and where it really matters. And I want to acknowledge that when we first started doing the work that we do in 2012, I will very honestly tell you that we had yet to see a public records request for social media. And it may have happened, we just weren't aware of it. And what we were doing was we were looking at email, and we were looking at other forms of content, text messaging, and saying, well, again, by the definition of the law, this is bound to happen with social media. And a lot of agencies were coming to us with recognizing that same fact. Fast forward to 2018, we see records requests for social media all the time. We see records requests specifically for Facebook content, for Twitter content, after disasters, after controversies. It comes in all the time. Now, we've published case studies about these records requests. We've encouraged agencies we work with to tell those stories to inform others. So we put out a lot of material out there. I will still say that it's very unlikely that you've received a records request for Twitter and Facebook. So we're seeing a lot of them, but in the grand scheme of records requests, public records requests, a very small percentage are naming social media in the records request. But here's the kicker. This is something that agencies that we work with have realized over time, is that more and more, because social media has come to the forefront of how you communicate, the same old records request that you used to receive that was pretty general, any and all documents, all notifications of the street closure, all emails and communications between, now include social media. In fact, because social media is so important in certain situations, when you get a general records request like all notifications of the street closure, it may be that your social media was the primary and one of the only ways in which you were communicating and answering questions about that street closure. So you got that records request, didn't ask for Twitter or Facebook or the other sites, but you probably should, and you really should, respond with the social media communications, because that's where those communications happen. And so that's a huge realization, I think, for a lot of agencies, that the request might not have changed, but the way you use social media has, and the importance of it has. And so you may be receiving records requests for social media right now without realizing it. Now let me tell you about a specific situation. This is out of Florida. This was in the news, Washington County Clerk, the clerk's office. And it speaks to some of the other issues we'll talk about here, but it actually makes a very clear example of a real records request. So we know at Florida particularly, a lot of examples of public records requests there that Florida is at the forefront with, and then the rest of the country starts to see. And so in this situation, what happened was the county clerk, whoever's managing the social media, was removing some comments from a citizen the citizens felt like their viewpoint was being discriminated. They felt like because the clerk's office didn't agree with them that those comments were being removed, actually filed a lawsuit about that content being removed and requested the records. The clerk's office could then not produce those records because they did not have record keeping in place. When the citizen realized that the content could not even be produced, the citizen was savvy enough about the public records law to file a second lawsuit against the agency for failing to maintain and produce records of those deleted Facebook comments. Now, again, what's happened in all of these cases that we've seen, and there's been a few of these across the country, just like this, is that nobody wants to play this out because, again, the fight here could take months or years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So in all cases that we've seen, these situations have been settled, and so in this case, they settled for $10,000. But I think it really obviously draws attention to the savviness of the public and the reality of these records requests happening. So if you put it all together, when we talk about records requests, and really from our experience working with agencies across the country, public records law and requirements, that is at the foundation of why you should have records. Public records requests are happening, but there's actually a bigger picture to why you need to have records and what will justify you to have to produce records. And we like to boil it down to this diagram that you see here, is that social media is incredibly important to you. You use it in very important ways in your agency. You have this somewhat open forum with your users, and you have this third-party content that can show up at any time, and this issue of moderating, removing content. And then you have this third-party content that can just set off a firestorm. It can create controversy. Things can go viral, and it's out of your control. So you bring that mix together, and in any one of these combinations or by themselves, there's an inevitable need to produce social media records. And by the way, these records could be public records requests. It could be a legal situation where it's e-discovery, or it could be an internal request. It could be your city manager saying, hey, this situation isn't going so well. Give me everything that's happened on social media right now. And we've seen that happen quite a few times as well. So just to summarize this, there's citizen engagement is a huge part of this. This is social media is a two-way channel, really unlike any other medium. It's a broadcast out in public where the public can partake and communicate to you while you're sleeping on the weekends. You know, some of the most difficult circumstances, of course, they happen on the weekends, but it can happen. And by the way, the majority of the time, this is a really great thing. It's really great to hear from the public, have this two-way conversation, but in a legal sense, it's very challenging. Crime and safety, of course, communicating out about public safety events, emergencies, shootings, weather events, or just solving crimes on an ongoing basis, soliciting crime tips. I mentioned emergency management here and crisis communication. Of course, in today's environment, politics at the forefront, policy challenges, lots of different opinions on major topics. All of these are areas that have created increased scrutiny, and every one of these is being discussed on your social media pages if you're active on social media. In fact, you're in many cases with the crime and safety, emergency management, you may be communicating more rapidly there because you need to, because of the value of communicating there. But these topics, this is what's happening on social media today, and again, leads to increased scrutiny. So with that, I'm going to actually go through the three areas. I'd mentioned that there are three areas in which we are seeing social media records being incredibly important and records requests being formulated, the importance of having to respond to those. And I'm going to go through them one by one. And the first, which we've actually hinted on a few times, and is probably not a surprise to you because if you read the news, you've seen this. Citizens are increasingly wary, increasingly perceiving that government may be stepping over their First Amendment rights. Again, this is their perception, and sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. Sometimes we need to see what the courts decide. But this perception that First Amendment rights are being violated is a huge issue. And you've probably seen this more recently with the political environment, but I do want to call out this has been the case for a long time. It's actually just built up over time. They actually started in 2012 with this case in Honolulu, and I'm not sure we have the slide in here for that, but a real quick overview of that situation. 2012. This is really the first lawsuit of its kind in government social media. The Honolulu Police Department was receiving comments from a citizen who was commenting on gun ownership, and they felt like it wasn't relevant. They removed the comments. They ultimately banned the individual. He filed a lawsuit alleging First Amendment discrimination violation. And this was, again, what I'm aware of as the first lawsuit of its kind in government social media. And it was settled. It was settled for over $30,000. But it really brought to light this issue of what can a government do on a forum that's government controlled? Do you have to let it all fly? Do you have to let it all out there? Or can you moderate to some extent? I'm going to give you some guidance on that, channeling, again, what's happening in the industry. But it started in 2012. It kept happening. 2014, the San Diego Sheriff's Department, the sheriff removed some comments that were critical of the sheriff, and the lawsuit was filed. And what the sheriff did at that time was he shut down their Facebook page. Maybe in 2014 that was okay, but certainly not a long-term strategy. I would ask many of you, if you're familiar at all with what's happening on your social media, if your agency is active on social media, what would happen if social media disappeared tomorrow? How would you communicate? What kind of detriment would that be? And what we've seen with agencies that have shut down their pages, they've ultimately had to bring them back because, again, overwhelmingly there's value in social media. So a similar situation would be Beech Grove, Indiana. This is from 2016 now. And what's interesting about this case, again, it related to comments being removed by the agency, alleged First Amendment violation. What's interesting about the situation is the ACLU in Indiana got involved and they filed a lawsuit. So it's one thing for a citizen to complain. It's an entirely different thing for a powerful interest group and to then take that lawsuit. So the ACLU not only filed this one in Beech Grove, but they filed two more in Indiana on the same basis. And now what we're seeing is the ACLU and other chapters across the country, when they feel that the First Amendment is being violated, they are taking action on this issue. And so this goes on and on and on. You've seen it with particularly public officials. I'll draw attention to the fact that this is front page news from everyone from the president on down, president, governors, mayors in major cities. And the really important thing to recognize there is say this is being talked about at the presidential level. What it does is it creates awareness. It creates a lot of awareness to your local constituents about, okay, well, I wonder if my public official is doing that. And it can create some challenges for you. Now, again, we'll talk about in this session steps you can take to be proactive so that when you are challenged on it, no problem, you've done what you needed to do and you can weather that storm. But I do want to draw attention to the fact that there's a significant amplified awareness to these issues because of what's happening in the political sphere at all levels. And on that note of public officials, one challenge that we run across is that as an agency, you may have strong jurisdiction over your own actions, over your own policy, but it can be a real struggle to work with those public officials. You can tell them what they need to do, but it may be hard to get them to do what they need to do. But I want to emphasize this is really important, again, because of all the news that's swirling around the high-profile public officials. With your local public officials, remember that what they are doing on social media in context of official business is subject to the same exact rules as your agency. So if they are at all communicating on behalf of the business of the agency, communications they send and receive can constitute public record. The removal of content can be a big issue. And in fact, there's a case out of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, just from last year that I want to cover here. And what essentially happened, and the reason, by the way, I highlight this case is, again, this notion that as an agency, you have somewhat of, in most agencies we work with, feel somewhat limited control over what their public officials are doing. And it can be easy initially to say, well, that's them and this is us, and we're not going to worry about it. But an agency with its public officials, you're all really in the same boat. And this case really brought that to light. What happened here is that the mayor had a Facebook page, Darren Brown had a Facebook page in Chambersburg, and on that page would discuss public business, was receiving comments in relation to public business, and some comments were removed, again, to this whole First Amendment issue. A records request was filed to the city for the mayor's Facebook page. Now, the city originally responded saying, well, listen, this is the mayor's page. We didn't create it. We don't run it. We're not responsible for it. We're not going to respond to this records request. The issue challenge ultimately was taken to the Pennsylvania Open Records Office, which ultimately ruled that, yes, the city is responsible for this records request. It actually turned out that the mayor's Facebook page was linked from the city's page, so there was some correlation there. But the bigger thing was that the mayor is a public official, and he discussed public business. And so the ruling here really talks about how the social media content was in relation to the public business. This is a valid public records request that the city could not just simply turn down and say they had no responsibility for. Okay, so I've given you a few examples of where this can go bad and why it's a challenge and how the public officials can certainly make this more difficult. Let's talk about solutions here for a moment. And we really are here to be a resource to you and provide as much guidance as we can. both through our slides and again the questions. So again, a quick plug, if you have any questions, go ahead and get those in. What I want to cover is a high level on how to think about comment moderation. Again, these are best practices. None of these lawsuits that we've seen have been taken from start to finish where a court rules on an ultimate conclusion. So everything here is best practice because, again, these lawsuits tend to get settled early on. But the best practice is a very accepted view on social media throughout the industry that the social media page that you create as a government agency is not this open, completely open forum. It is a limited public forum. This is a known designation, a known phrasing. And so you can actually, in this limited public forum, limit the topic of speech or and the class of speakers to the extent as long as you're not overstepping or discriminating based on viewpoint. So you really want to separate viewpoint and opinion. You want to separate those from the content of what's being said. And so to make this real, to give you a real example, if somebody says something critical of you or your public official, related to what you just posted about, that may be a very negative post. Again, it's critical of you, but it's on topic and it's just an opinion you don't agree with. Well, you do not want to moderate on that viewpoint being different than the one you want to see. That's where we overstep on First Amendment. However, if that person said the same thing, but used a lot of profanity, or obscenity, or pornographic imagery, or racially charged speech, or they're just completely off topic, and you've designated your public forum with a set of rules that say that type of speech is not allowed, then you have the room to moderate. And again, you want that in a very clear policy, and you want to be able to follow that in a very consistent manner. So you want to make that policy crystal clear for yourself and for your staff, and then follow through on it. And we love this quote. This is from one of our customers out of Palmer, Alaska. People have a right to engage on our social media pages. If what they say doesn't violate our policy, it remains. If it does, it gets hidden. Having a policy is about liability and protection for everyone, right? At the end of the day, you need to show as an agency that you've taken all of the appropriate steps. You've created the policies. You're following to the best of your ability. Now, your staff members may sometimes not. They may go off on their own, but you as an agency can demonstrate at least that you've done what you need to do, and that's really important. And so, on that note of the policy, I want to mention that. That not only should you have a very clear comment moderation policy, but it's incredibly important to train your staff on it and get them to understand it, because inevitably in an organization that has a growing social media presence, you will have more than one social media manager on that page at some point. And maybe it's someone that's supposed to back up. Maybe it's actually separate departments where you have different social media managers. And so having a policy is important, but implementing it consistently is equally important. How do you do that? Well, we have this really great resource from one of our customers, which is Wake County, North Carolina, and we loved this so much. We asked them if we could just steal and share it out to the rest of government, and they were happy to do it. And so we have this flow chart which starts with a set of questions, yes or no, and does it have profane language, yes or no? No. Then go to the next step, and you can just simply follow this flow chart. And the great thing is you can print this out and put it in front of all your social media managers. And so when they have those sticky situations, they just follow the flow. It's not like they're reading this legalese anymore. They're following the flow, and you get that consistent practice. So this is a resource that we have, again, from Wake County. It's not from us, but we're happy to channel it and share it out, and we can do so outside of this presentation. So to summarize, post clear guidelines and policy. If you don't have a social media policy, step one, get one in place. Again, we also have templates for that. That we'll freely share. In that template, we do have a comment moderation policy. You want to be really clear about the rules of the forum, and then you can make sure that you keep that forum in a state that you're happy with, moderating content consistently with that. In order to do that, you of course need to train those social media administrators. That flowchart is a great tool to do that. And what we've seen time and time again is this importance of consistency. In fact, I'll give you an example of a case study here in a little bit of citizens feeling like they're being treated unfairly, and so being consistent allows you to say, nope, this is the policy and we're following it. Number two, I spent a lot of time on First Amendment, but again, big issue. I'm going to touch on two more areas where we're seeing social media generate records of real interest and value, of real legal context. And broadly, we call this bucket situations where agencies just aren't prepared for that increased scrutiny that social media can bring to you. it can bring to your city or town or village. You may have a very small agency. It doesn't matter. Social media is a broadcast to the public, and that attention can come to you at any time. In fact, one of the ways that it can come to you most easily, as you all know from social media, is things can go viral. You can't initially control what shows up on your social media page. You can moderate it to the terms of your policy, but you can't stop it from getting there in the first place. And again, most of the time, it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing that citizens can comment back and communicate with its government and create that transparency and accountability between government and citizens. But again, those situations where it's bad can be really bad and things can go viral. And so I have an example here for you out of South Daytona, Florida. If you're not familiar with South Daytona, it's a very small town, about 12,000 people population. Their social media presence is modest, to say the least. It's a good presence, but it's one where there's just a few comments, posts a week, nothing crazy, until something went viral. So here's what happened. I'm going to show a photo here just for a second. I warned those with a love for pets. It's kind of a hard photo to look at, but it helps tell part of the story. And some of you may have seen this in national news. Is a woman on her own private Facebook page, not the city's page, but her own private personal profile, decided one day to post a photo of very bad taste. Here's the photo. And it's a photo of her duct taping a dog's mouth. And she thought she was being funny with this. She put it on her own page. Fortunately, her friends have a much better sense of right and wrong, and really were upset by this, and they actually started to spread it. And so it went viral from this person's private Facebook account. It went viral nationally. In this process, the one thing that was noticed was that in the woman's profile, South Daytona was tagged as her location. So the citizens of South Daytona came out virtually with their pitchforks to South Daytona's Facebook page and started to criticize the agency. How could you let this happen? Why aren't you doing anything about this? This is animal cruelty. Why can't we find this person? All this kind of stuff, right? And this small town with one social media manager, small population, received 24,000 comments in just a few days. 24,000 comments. This is national news. The national media is running stories. The national media is issuing a records requests to South Daytona all while this is happening. So you can imagine how incredibly overwhelming this was. Now here's the good thing, the good news. This agency did exactly what they needed to do. They used the power of social media for good, again, and they used social media to communicate back what's happening, what they were doing about it, how the law enforcement was working with law enforcement across the country. And start to finish, they communicated in a consistent, transparent manner. And by the end of it, they had done a 180 on that citizen perception, public perception, where the citizens were initially angry. At the very end, you should see those comments. The citizens were so thankful to the city of South Daytona for their actions. There was so much gratitude and appreciation that was shared because of that social media usage. So again, social media is a very positive thing, but during this time, very overwhelming. Now, they were archiving. They were able to use the system to do the records request, produce the records, and able to weather that storm. Here's the kicker. The woman that posted that photo that had South Daytona as her location, she didn't live in South Daytona anymore. She just hadn't updated her profile. So here it is. A post on someone's private social media who doesn't even live in your town somehow creates this viral firestorm for you. And that's the reality of this open communication. So good, but it can have the side effects that you can never anticipate. And the moral of the story is that this agency was prepared. They had policies, they had record keeping, and they weathered the storm. One more quick one. This is a sheriff's office that we weren't working with at the time. We are now as a result of some learnings out of the situation. But essentially, the sheriff's office dealt with a viral firestorm again because the sheriff, some members of law enforcement were at a Chinese restaurant, and this is at a time of in our country where there was kind of a heightened sense of discord between citizens and law enforcement. And while they're eating lunch, the owner's son comes out and says, "Hey, we don't want law enforcement here. Please don't come back." Now, the sheriff decides to post this on their Facebook page, on the official Facebook page, kind of vent on this issue, on what happened there. And of course, it's created a huge controversy, pro and against, different views on law enforcement, all on their page, and it kind of brought them into a viral situation inadvertently. Generated 3 million views. The post was shared 40,000 times, 30,000 comments. And they were not record keeping at the time. Now we have this offering called crisis support where we can help out in crisis situations. It's not a commercial offering, and so we were able to help them out. But it really brought to light that while something can happen to you because it's sort of very obvious, sometimes when your public officials or staff members think that they're doing something that they feel is right, not everybody else views it that way, and it can create a real viral firestorm for you as well. Okay, so that was another category. Again, the citizen commentary, the possibility things can go viral, both from external means and from your internal staff. And the last is just the danger area for agencies around social media is, regardless of why it's being requested, there are many reasons why social gets requested, just not being prepared to produce records of social media. And taking us back to the public records discussion in California, and particularly, this is a situation from early last year from City of San Mateo, where a citizen recognized that the agency was using social media, actually initially issued a records request to the police department asking for some of the private messages that the police department received. It turns out that the police department's Twitter account had been hacked, and all of those private messages had been deleted. So when the request came in, they were unable to fulfill it because all those direct messages had been deleted. The woman realized this, got this response back, looked at the policy for the city, saw that the city did not have anything about social media retention in their policy, and then filed a lawsuit against the city and the mayor, pointing out, A, that the city just didn't have a plan for social media records, at least in their policy, and B, this issue of First Amendment violations. So this is all coming together. And so, again, this is a lawsuit that is going directly at this notion of social media being a public record, and all, again, highlighting the First Amendment concerns. This was also settled as well. I will then take us back to, okay, well, that's being unprepared. What does being prepared look like? In 2013, before, frankly, we had seen really any social media records requests, the city of Spokane, Washington, came to us and said, we've dealt with a lot of headache around email records requests. We need to get ahead of social media. And 6 months after they started archiving, they received a lawsuit. Now, it's really an unfortunate situation where the city's parks department had helped promote this yearly kayaking trip. The weather was not ideal on a certain day. They still did the kayaking trip. A young man fell out of the kayaking trip, fell out of the kayak, and actually died. And so in the lawsuit from the plaintiff's family, they actually included the city and asked for all communications related to that kayak trip from over 2 years, because they wanted to understand the different weather precautions and so forth. And so the city of Spokane received this legal request for records. And so we actually did a case study with them where they talked about how in Washington, you have a limited amount of time to respond to a records request. And without a record-keeping approach in place, they felt that they probably wouldn't have met that time period, and frankly, probably wouldn't have been able to respond at all. And I take this back to, well, where did that records request come from? It came from simply communicating about a regular community event. This is something that every agency does, communicating about the 4th of July parade or St. Patrick's Day coming up here. If you've got a propensity for March Madness, as we do here in North Carolina, we're right in the middle of basketball country. You communicate about these local events, and it feels so innocuous. But because you are so important to people's lives, because social media is so important to these communications, the kinds of things that could somehow become lawsuits can still somehow become lawsuits, and now they'll pull your social media in. And last one here, I kind of hinted at this one, this idea of comment moderation and weathering the storm. So this is a success story as well, where Charlotte County, Florida, had a notorious spammer where the person kept violating policy. They had a very clear policy. They warned the individual. Ultimately, after multiple violations, they blocked the individual from the Facebook page. The person then thought that they were being treated unfairly or their viewpoint was being discriminated against. They then issued a records request in preparation for a lawsuit. Charlotte County was archiving, was able to produce a PDF of everything that happened on the page, highlighting that person's comments, what was deleted, what was hidden, send it over, and lo and behold, no lawsuit, because they did exactly what they needed to do. They were prepared, they had record keeping, they had a policy in place, they followed it consistently, and there was no case to be made. So again, a real good success story that brings us all together here. Ooh, and I got one more for you. So this goes on and on, and hopefully you have an appetite for the real situations. I hope it's not too scary, but again, this is happening to other folks, and now you can get in a position so that doesn't happen to you. And this is a situation out of California. It's actually top of mind with what's happening in the news today around gun ownership, and it's an issue that has two strong viewpoints. And in California, in Santa Barbara, they had decided to do a gun buyback program. This is a city initiative. The police department posted about it, and there was a huge controversy on their Facebook page. Lots of questions being asked as well about the logistics of the event. And they were not keeping records, but they just started a free trial of archiving. And so they were archiving in their free trial. And 3 weeks into the free trial, they received a records request from the National Rifle Association. And the records request was all communications related to the gun buyback. Now, again, most of it happened on social media, and so they knew they had to produce it. And so then we did a case study with them as well. And they talked about how if they didn't have a record-keeping approach in place, they would have to scroll endlessly through Facebook, screenshotting, would have likely missed something, and it would have been a complete disaster. Instead, they were prepared, and a very powerful, well-funded organization made a records request. Could have become something much worse. It didn't. They were able to respond to it. They were able to weather the storm and run more of these programs without any kind of issue. So to sum this up, the issue that we see today is that most agencies are actually not in compliance with public records law to the fullest extent possible. You may be able to pull some of that information off the sites, and we'll talk more about the sites here in a moment. But you're not at a level of compliance that I think any of us would say is satisfactory. We'll talk about the social networks here. They actually do not retain records for you, and so I'll dive into that in detail. And records requests are coming in both for social media, but if you are receiving other records requests and social media is important to you, it's likely those records requests already include social media. So I know I covered a lot of material there. We've gone on for a bit of time. We're going to pause. I'm going to hand back to Stephanie to see if we have any questions.
Thanks, Neil. Yes, we do. We have a lot of great questions coming in. Some of they've been coming in kind of throughout the whole presentation. So we have some that are, dating back to what you talked about maybe 10 minutes ago, but just kind of scroll through some of these. So one of them is a couple questions about deleted Facebook records. People want to know, how do you actually get those deleted Facebook records?
How do you get the deleted Facebook records? Great question, and we have a few more slides on this later on, but I'll tackle this one now because it is so important. If something has been deleted and you don't have a record of it, if you just were expecting it to be on Facebook, the answer is you can't retrieve it. In fact, if you go to Facebook's website for law enforcement, and this is similar on Twitter as well, Facebook says, law enforcement, if you need to get records from us, you may subpoena us, but you must do so before content has been deleted. I'm paraphrasing here. So the networks have a strict policy that says once it's deleted, it's not there. We can't give it to you. And what this really then leads to is the only way to produce deleted Facebook records is to have kept a record of that information before it was deleted. And so we will talk about that more and give you some best practices on archiving and record keeping here.
Great. Another question we have, or which we're getting a few different variations of, is can you have a Facebook page that doesn't allow comments or public response, something that's just a place to just post things?
Can you have a Facebook page that's basically one way, where you can put information out and not receive it? The answer, it's a little bit nuanced, but the flat answer that I'd like you to take away is no, you cannot, and really you should not. And we do have a set of slides on this as well. But there's both a philosophical answer to this, and then there's actually a technical answer to it. The philosophical answer is, time and time again, we've seen that agencies who partake on social media, the entire benefit of social media is being social, having that two-way. So having a one-way approach may dilute many of your goals and intentions here. Now, obviously, we're concerned about records, we're concerned about legal challenges, so you may have reasons to try to pursue this one-way approach. This is something that was done across the board, I feel like, across the country in a lot of places in about 2009, 2010. What we've seen is by and large across the board, one-way social media is a strategy that doesn't work, both, again, from the philosophy standpoint, but also because the platforms technically don't make that possible. So on Facebook, you used to be able to turn off comments many years ago. You can't do that. Again, this is more than 5 years ago. You cannot turn off comments. So while you can stop citizens from creating top-level posts, you can't just toggle comments off. Private messaging on a lot of networks can't be turned off. Twitter, you can't stop mentions from coming in. So on and on and on, these platforms are designed for two-way, and technically you can't turn it off. Now, there are some tricks. Some agencies have figured out by setting certain settings on Facebook and uploading keywords lists, you can sort of filter information from showing up on your Facebook page. You can essentially put in a list of the top 50 keywords in the English language, and Facebook can flag them for you before it posts, and it's a way of trying to implement this one way. We actually have an agency, Vineland, New Jersey. We did a case study with them that did this. The attorneys wanted to do this to again, mitigate risk. And a citizen noticed that every time they post something, it was being hidden. In fact, they noticed that nobody's comments were showing up. And so this one-way social media was being implemented, and the citizen actually contacted the police department and said, you must be hiding something. I'm going to issue a public records request once a month, every month until you stop. They did it for 3 straight months until Vineland started archiving to be able to respond to those records requests in a sane manner. And they stopped. And so again, time and time again, we've seen that strategy just not play out in a positive fashion for agencies. So how do you mitigate the risks? How do you mitigate the records concerns? Rather than making it a one-way forum, we'll talk to you about record-keeping approaches here in this presentation.
Okay, great. A few more questions. We have some questions about records retention schedules for social media. So a few people want to know, how long is the records retention schedule for social media? And then kind of another version of that question is, can you add language to your social media accounts indicating that you have the right to delete comments after a certain period of time?
Oh, that's really interesting. So I'll take that question in 2 parts. The first part being around retention periods. Blanket answers I would defer to frankly many of you in your own jurisdiction or your legal teams on how to treat social media. But the blanket answer is treat it exactly the way you treat everything else, because retention schedules in government, generally speaking, at least from an ideal standpoint, are based on content, not physical form. And so again, a crime tip is a crime tip. Citizen complaint, citizen complaint. So whatever the retention period for a citizen complaint is, an email or anything else, the same for social. Again, that's the ideal academic answer. Some agencies then, to be more pragmatic, will try to implement more umbrella periods, and that may be 1 year, 3 years. I would strongly advocate against something like 30 days, because 30 days tells me you are then treating everything like administrative value. And if you're using social media at all, and it's useful in your agency's communications with the public, it doesn't take but 5 minutes to scroll through your Facebook page and point out records that should not be deleted within 30 days. So I think it's dangerous to take an approach that treats social media as temporary. But you may think of longer blanket periods, and that's again where I would defer to your records management experts locally.
Great.
And the second question on putting in your policy around deleted, that you may delete some content eventually. We actually I haven't seen any agencies, and I think here at Archive Social, I'm looking at folks here in the room, Stephanie as well, who does a lot of work with our customers. We have not seen agencies take a blanket approach to deleting content off of Facebook or Twitter after some time periods, some kind of disposition period off the social network. So I tread carefully with that practice. It'd be very difficult to implement, actually. And it may actually cause a lot of alarm by the citizens and the folks out there wondering why you're doing that. It does speak to the fact that you, as a records manager, you've put record keeping in place. Maybe you've implemented a retention period that you then dispose these records from your archive. It does speak to the fact that this information could still be out there on Facebook or Twitter. And so there is this interesting disconnect with the fact that this is publicly broadcast. So I will be honest with you, the vast majority of agencies we work with, while we do provide full support for retention disposition based on content and based on umbrella periods, the vast majority of agencies we work with just take an approach that they're going to retain everything forever. Approaches to record keeping, that will not, the way this is done now is that will not inflate your costs anyway, so there's no longer a cost concern. So agencies will just keep these records indefinitely, because not only for public records, but for legal situations and to have the history. It tends to be the common approach.
Great. Okay, we have a lot of great questions coming in. Maybe we'll do 1 or 2 more right now and then save the rest of them for the end.
Perfect.
Okay, great. So this one is, without an IT department, would you recommend that the clerk has all access rights to all social media sites?
It really boils down to the actual roles and responsibilities. When it comes to record keeping, alone. We'll talk about some approaches here. You don't need that for record keeping. There are ways for you to, as a clerk, to manage those records without actually having to have full authority on those pages. It's certainly helpful to have the extra keys, as you might say, to the house there. We have seen clerks that are involved with social media, so in that sense, for sure. Kind of stepping back, a more common practice is when your agency and your social media folks create a page, having a process for understanding what pages are being created, being able to register those, approve those as part of your policy has been really helpful for a lot of agencies. And then when you do that, making sure that the credentials don't just sit with an individual, that the agency has some access. So best practice on a network like Facebook, where you use your own Facebook account to manage an agency page, is to always ensure you have at least 2 administrators in case one leaves, one goes rogue, or whatever else might happen. And in that case, in a lot of ways, it does make sense to have a clerk sign in as an extra administrator on the pages, because it can help with record keeping, even though it's not a requirement.
Okay, great. And let's see, we'll do one last question before we move on. And this one goes back to the question about public officials and social media. I think a lot of people are wondering who is responsible for archiving a public official's personal social media in instances where they discuss government business. Is it the official themselves, or is it the agency?
This is a really, really tricky area. And so again, what I'll do here is I'll channel what we're seeing here throughout the user base that we have. I actually want to start with this notion of an official's private social media. So there is a big difference between a public official has a private Facebook page with friends and family and neighbors. In this private Facebook page, he or she occasionally communicates about official business. That's a big problem. And the best solution, while nothing's perfect here, the cleanest solution is to institute policy and say, you just cannot do that. You don't talk about public business on your very private pages, because the moment you do that, you turn those pages into public record. And so you set that policy first. Now, they may still do it, but at least at a minimum, you've set the policy and positioned your agency to be protected, because you've told these officials not to do that. Then you go from there, and public officials, while they may have a private Facebook account they're using with friends and family that's locked down, it's a closed page, a lot of them now have these open public pages that are actually created for public business. And so that's really what we're talking about here, is that your mayor, your council member, whoever it is, has a public page where they've decided they want to conduct public business on it, and they're using it. Now, it's their page, but it's out in the public. Again, that's where we've seen agencies make these officials aware of the policy, make them aware of approaches to solve these problems, whether it's the comment moderation flow that we shared with you, whether it's the record-keeping approaches we're about to share with you, make them aware. We haven't seen a lot of great luck with actually enforcing it because of that divide between the agency and the public officials. City of Durham is a really interesting example. Our headquarters is in Durham, North Carolina. That's actually where we're sitting right now. And we actually met with the city earlier this week, and they have successfully worked with their public officials to understand public records requirements, understand the social media implications, and did so and presented these types of case studies, by the way, to create enough belief there that they need to do something about it. So again, they influenced them very strongly to the point that the city council here is now archiving and implementing the same policies that the city has already implemented many years ago. So that's probably the best thing you can do, is influence them. And certainly we're open to folks who have had hearing stories from folks who have had more success translating your policies to public officials and getting some enforcement there.
Great. We have a lot more questions, and hopefully we'll kind of get time for those at the next break for questions. But if you want to keep going, Neil, that'd be great.
Well, first of all, thank you all for the dialogue here. I know you're not able to speak on this crowded webinar that we have. We appreciate you all being here, but at least seeing your questions come in and understanding the issues you're dealing with is just helpful to me, and we'll keep taking those questions as we go. So before I transition now into more of a solutions aspect of this presentation, we wanted to take a poll. And it's a golden question based on what we've asked throughout and what we've covered throughout regarding social media being a record, these really difficult situations. Now to put you in those shoes to say, if you were to receive a records request for social media today, how would you respond? And so the poll should be on the screen for you now, and appreciate all of you responding, giving us a sense of where you sit today. Would you just try to get the records from the social network? Would you take screenshots? Do you have a social media archive already, or is it I just have no idea? Okay, great. We have a majority of responses in here, and we see the results. Okay, great, and thank you all for this. So first of all, kudos to about a third of you who already have some kind of archive in place. Really great to see you take action and be at the forefront of this issue and be able to go back to an archive to produce records. A third of you turning to screenshots. This is very common, makes a lot of sense. Go to the network and take those screenshots, try to get that record now in reaction. And thank you to the 1/5 of you, the 20% that said, look, I have no idea, and appreciate the humility there and coming in this presentation. Really, if I do my job here in the next part of this presentation, we'll give you some guidance so that the next time you get this poll, you can answer one of those other questions and you will have an idea. So that's my mission here now for the time we have remaining. And I'm going to take this poll back down. And let's get back to our slides. And we're going to talk about managing social media records and what you can actually do. Now, we've really laid out the problem sphere here in terms of social media being a record and all the ways that you may be asked for records. I'm actually going to amplify the problem just a little bit more before I talk about the solution to say, when you start to try to solve it, it gets even harder for a moment. And I'm going to tell you why, and then I'll give you some solutions on how you can come back and have record keeping if you were to get that records request, say, tomorrow. So let's start with the anatomy of a social media records request. When you receive that request, likely if you're a clerk and let's say you're not involved with the social media, it's a records request that involves social media. One of the first things you need to do is relay it to the individual that actually has the keys to the social media kingdom. And you need to go, well, we have this records request for this Facebook content. Can you get that for me? Right? This is the situation that most agencies are in that don't have an archive or a record keeping approach. Now, you would hope that that person says, yeah, no problem. I have the keys to Facebook or YouTube or Pinterest or whatever site they're using, and I can produce those records. But as we've talked about, and I've hinted at, and I'll give you some more detail on, you can't rely on those records just being there on the network. So that's the key question. What are you going to do if you can't produce it? And again, it's not just this is the clerk's problem or this is the PIO's problem. This is a collaboration. And so in fact, a lot of times when we work with agencies on social media record keeping, the communications team is involved with this. Again, because they do have the keys to the social media sites, and they need to be acutely aware of this issue and the fact that records are being generated, and that they need to be involved with ensuring that whatever sites are being used for social media are covered by a record-keeping approach. Okay, so let's go through like an academic example of what makes this so hard. Why is it that you can't just go to that PIO or social media manager and say, produce those records for me? And we'll put deletion outside. We'll flag that already, and you'll see in this example. But let me walk through this whole example because you'll just see how complicated this gets. Now, this is a scenario we have on Instagram where a city has posted a photo of vandalism, soliciting crime tips. They get a comment right out the gate that says, oh, this is terrible. Okay, this comment isn't really a record of value, but it's nice that empathy was shown. Now imagine 6 months, 9 months go by, and suddenly your social media manager's moved on, right? We're not looking at this Instagram post anymore. Suddenly this comment comes in from a citizen saying it happened again. And the citizen calls out another citizen's social media handle saying that this citizen actually has evidence of it happening again. Again, this is a comment that showed up 9 months after you post this. No one's even looking at this anymore, but this comment pops up. Now, the citizen that's being mentioned, Great Jackson's case, doesn't like being mentioned on this government page and says, hey, I had nothing to do with this. I was just taking a photo, taking pics. Don't call me out. Responds back. The first user realizes that, okay, maybe I shouldn't have called this person out. Edits their comment. You no longer have that mention. The second user sees they're no longer being mentioned. Deletes. So again, this is something that was posted on your social media. 9 months have gone by, but it's an open channel where anyone at any time can come back and post. They can post something that could be of value. They can change their mind. They can delete, edit. And guess what? Now you finally go back to Instagram and you look at this, and all you see is your post and the edited comment. You don't have the original first version of that comment. You don't even have that comment that was posted and deleted because it's not on Instagram. It's not provided. The network doesn't keep that record. It doesn't make it obvious. It would have never told you that something got deleted. This dynamic nature of social media, these types of challenges, the fact that these open communications are happening and they're changing and evolving and getting deleted, this is the reality of social media day in and day out. And it makes record keeping a little bit of a challenge. So why is it challenging? Well, again, it's dynamic. It's out of your control. Keep in mind that with something like email, with websites, with SharePoint, historically, these records are in your control. They're on some server you control. Even if you're hosting your website with somebody, you have full control over that. You can take backups and have version history on your website. Your citizens can't just change your website for you, right? You have a lot of control over most content. Even text messaging, there's 4 major carriers. They have all the data, and they've worked with companies to have that information. There's somewhere to go to get this data. But Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and Vimeo and Instagram, these sites are third-party companies that are not built for compliance. They have no obligation to you. There's no one-stop shop to get this data. It's completely out of your control. To the extent that if something gets deleted, you can't even rely on the network to get it. Now, even if the records are there, by the way, if you've ever tried this, it's really hard to search 9 months back or 2 years back or 3 months back. It's really hard to find things. The search is very simple. And then also, when you go to these networks, what you see is not exactly your entire record. There are issues of metadata and the details. So, a tweet may be 280 characters, but there's more than 2,000 characters of information behind a tweet in terms of metadata that could be part of the public record as well in terms of user IDs and timestamps. There's a lot of challenges here, and I kind of glossed over that a little bit in terms of technical challenges. If you have some of those questions, I don't want to get too technical here on this presentation, but if you have any of those questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. Happy to address that while we have everyone here. But I do want to come back on this one-way communication question that was raised earlier. A great question to ask. It does come up. And came up a lot, again, in the early stages for a lot of cities and counties. We're seeing that a little bit more now with school districts who seem to be just about 2 or 3 years behind local government when it comes to social media. And to summarize what I said verbally, again, there's really no way technically to turn off user engagement. Again, on Facebook, can't turn off the comments. On Twitter, you can't stop someone from mentioning you. You can't have people, not private message you on some of these platforms. So there's just no consistent way to block them. And again, going back to the philosophical answer I gave, there's really no good reason to long term. It'll really dilute and impede the benefit of social media. And as we get through this next section, you'll see that there is a way to keep records, and you can mitigate the types of challenges that would normally make you want to go one way, be two-way, get the positive benefits of social media, but have record keeping and policy in place to protect yourself on that slim possibility, those rare circumstances that could get you in trouble. And on the social networks, again, I'll keep this up here. You cannot rely on the social networks. So I know about a third of you said if you had a records request today, you would go back and screenshot, which works great if that information is still there. Now, there are a couple of different ways to think about going back to the social network. There's a screenshotting. I'll skip around just a little bit. There's also this notion of using a download feature on a social network. I do want to talk about those because not all of you may be aware of it, but those of you who are aware of it may be going, well, I've heard that Twitter has an archive built in or Facebook has a download your data feature. I want to be really clear about this because it's quite a misnomer, unfortunately, how these networks have positioned these features. These features have been built for consumers to be able to download their own posts. They were not built and do not function in any means for regulatory situations for government agencies. So if you go and download all of your data from Facebook, you will have your posts that you put out there, which is helpful, which is part of public. You will not have the comments from the citizens. You will not have private messaging. Twitter, if you use Twitter's archive feature, you will get what's still public on Twitter. But if you delete anything yourself, it's not there in that download. So it's not even an archive, really. It's a snapshot. It will not have any of the mentions from the public. It will not have any of the private messaging. So again, if you're aware of these download features, be careful with the naming there. They call them archives in some circumstances. They're really not. They're just a simple snapshot. And not only that, not only these download features being limited, but the network itself, again, won't keep your data if it's deleted. And so I want to hit this point a little bit harder. I know it came up in that question. And we at Archive Social, we always knew this was a problem. We really wanted to get a sense of how big of a problem deletions are. And so we've been running these studies now. The last one I want to show you is from July of last year. And what we did is we actually surveyed 500 of our government customers across all their social media. And we looked at those customers because our technology can actually detect deletions and flag them in the archive. So we knew which ones were affected by deletions, and we wanted to say, well, how big of a problem is this? 500 customers that at least had one deletion, they actually, in aggregate together, had nearly 215,000 deletions in 1 month. So I always confuse myself with the math here, but I think it comes down to something like 10 deletions a day per customer. It is an incredible volume of deletions in context in that entire month to see how much gets deleted, about more than 400 per customer, right? And so this is a staggering number. It was surprising to us as an archiving company, to be honest with you, and certainly shocking, I think, to agencies. Now, if you go to these 500 customers and you say, wow, you guys had a lot of deletions, you had an average 400 a month, they say, well, we don't delete anything. Our policy is to hide at most. It turns out that there are deletions that happen from the agency. Ultimately, a staff member, even though the policy is not delete, will post something and real quick want to change it and delete it. We see it happen. But the vast majority of this number does come from the citizens. So again, remembering that other side of the conversation is just as much public record as what you put out there, or could be, it could constitute long-term record. Citizens can share a crime tip. We literally had this happen yesterday. We had an agency report to us, I kid you not, that in a missing persons case, somebody messaged them photos from social media of essentially crime tips, someone sharing information. Actually, they've been communicating with the missing person. And it was shared to this agency on social media. And then when the agency went to go look on social media, it was already deleted. So this has literally happened yesterday. So citizens delete all the time. They delete some really important things. You can think about it like this. If you're a citizen, you happen to comment something influential on a crime situation, you may have second thoughts about that pretty quickly and delete it. And we do see most deletions happen quickly after the post. Not only can they delete individual posts, though, people will delete Facebook. You probably have a friend that's decided to quit Facebook, and if you decide to quit Facebook, it'll pull all of your data out. So a lot of ways these records can be lost. Now, we did only sample 500 customers, but I do want to say that when we then took step for this exact number, we stepped back to our entire customer base, well over 1,000 agencies. 95.4% of agencies had a deletion. So it's very rare if you're not affected by this problem. And the last thing I'll mention here is that these networks are just changing all the time. So here's a question, and we get this question all the time. How do you guys deal with Facebook Live? Well, Facebook Live, it came out a little while ago. I don't know if it was like a year and a half or 2 years ago, but we were archiving agencies for a long time before Facebook Live. And you wanted to share a video on Facebook, you would post on Facebook and upload a video. And your upload would take a little while, right, because it's a video. But by the time your communication went out to the public, there was a post with a video embedded inside of it, and we could grab that record. Then Facebook Live came out, and Periscope is similar to this. Instead of this video being collected and put online at the same time as your post, you immediately post and you say, we're live, and comments start coming in, and your video is still recording, right? And so it's this really unique technical problem where you've already communicated something, but the video is ongoing. Maybe it's a town hall meeting. Maybe you're showing details of a water line break, as we've had some customers do. And the video just goes and goes and goes, and you need to archive it. And these are the kinds of challenges that come up with these record keeping, and something that we had to crack, something that I think the industry in general still struggles with, actually, is live video. But it was critical that we had to figure this out. And it really spoke to the fact that these social networks have been evolving from day one. At some point in Facebook, you couldn't even, I think, edit, right? Now you can do live video, you can share emojis, you can share stickers, you can have nested conversations. And so unlike email or websites, this is evolving so fast, and it's evolving because some third-party company, Facebook or YouTube, decides to change something. They don't even often announce it. Users are often surprised, and it makes that records management that much harder. Okay, so those are the challenges. We are going to, the next section is about solutions. Quick pause, Stephanie, to see if we have any questions.
Yeah, it's interesting. We did actually have some questions about Facebook Live. If you could talk a little bit about archiving that, and people had questions about, hey, when people comment on Facebook Live, is that considered public record?
Well, sure. In fact, a Facebook Live post in most ways looks like any other posting on Facebook, like a normal status update. So when you post a status update, people can comment back, and those comments are communications received in conjunction with the agency's business. Well, the only difference with Facebook Live is instead of a text status update from you, it's a video. It's a live video. But it looks very much the same, and it works the same on Facebook. People can comment back to your video, and that does need to be archived and captured just like you would capture the normal normal comments on Facebook. And same with Twitter, Periscope, by the way.
Okay, great. Okay, another question we're getting is about Snapchat or Instagram stories or anything that sort of, goes away or disappears after a certain period of time. How would you, what would you recommend with regards to those things?
So for all of us records folks here, there is something really, really frustrating about a medium that's designed to destroy records, right? But that's the appeal of these networks, and it's really funny because I can't remember how many years ago now. It was probably 4 or 5 years ago. You can look for this on the blog. I literally wrote a blog post for our company at the time. I thought I was being funny. On April Fool's called "Our archiving for Snapchat has disappeared," right? So we didn't realize that these networks can come out. They have these unique capabilities, and people could adopt them. Now, what we've seen in government is a very light adoption of Snapchat. A lot of discussion about it, but because this information is being deleted by the network and it's designed to be deleted, it makes records management close to impossible. Now, in archiving for us, it comes down to, is the data available? Is there any way to get it? We can get it. And again, these networks are designed not to give it to you. They don't want that data to be available. They want it to disappear. And so we've advised agencies to tread very carefully, think about the records management implications. If you're posting something on Snapchat that's posted elsewhere, then it's a duplicate record, no big deal. But if there is that two-way conversation, or you're thinking about posting something unique, be aware of the records management challenge. Now, the shiniest object in the room tends to change quite quickly in social media, and we're seeing some interesting trends with Snapchat and Instagram stories. Instagram is a platform that we do archive. There is a path to ensuring that whatever's on your stories page can get archived, and we are starting to see more agencies go towards Instagram stories for that ephemeral behavior rather than Snapchat. But the best guidance in the industry right now is to tread carefully and understand that there is a records management challenge there.
Okay, great. And then kind of piggybacking off of that, we've also got some questions about, online chat or Facebook Messenger, because a lot of people seem to be using that for, council meetings or questions. And what would you recommend with regards to that?
So Facebook Messenger for council meetings. So really, there's this issue also of open meetings, right? And you don't want your public officials, again, sort of forming a meeting that's not open. But in general, these avenues like Messenger, they can be captured. We do archive Facebook messaging. Town halls and city halls, we do have agencies that broadcast those on Facebook Live. They put them on their Facebook page. So again, as long as you run that meeting according to your open meetings requirements, that's really the issue there. In terms of archiving, generally on platforms such as Facebook or YouTube, where we see town halls happening, there is the ability to archive that to the extent required.
Great. We're also seeing a few questions coming in just about social media policy and disclosures, which I know we covered a little while back, and just a little more specific. Does the city's Facebook page need to have a disclosure that communication postings will become public record like we do with our emails?
Highly recommended. And I'd go back to exactly why do you have that in your email? Inherently, the law is there, and you probably don't have to say it. You can reflect on the law that receives communications, but there is this awareness problem, right? People should be aware that if they're going to communicate with government, that this information can be retained and can be produced to third parties, because there are folks out there that feel that even if they broadcast something in public, that if they later change their mind and delete it, it should just be gone. And the best thing you can do is make them aware of, well, when it comes to a government entity and a government interaction, our page is subject to public disclosure and records laws. So if you comment to us, know that we're keeping records and could disclose that. Really good practice. So how do you do that? Essentially, what we see most agencies do is define their social media policy on their for social media on their website, and then link to it from their various social media profiles. So you can put a nice little shortened URL in your Twitter profile or your Facebook profile, and at a minimum, it links and say, here's our social media policy. Not only for public records again, but for comment moderation, very important. Some of the platforms, they do have some tricks. So for example, on Facebook, you can create a tab that encapsulates your social media policy, but at a minimum, linking to your website and allowing folks the opportunity to go, well, I wonder what the policy is here. Let me be aware of what might happen to my information. That at a minimum is definitely a highly recommended practice.
Okay, great answer, Neil. And I think in the interest of time, maybe we can move on to the next section and then tackle some of these towards the end.
Perfect. These are great questions, so keep them coming, and we will definitely leave some time here for questions at the end. So I told you I was going to amplify the problem a little bit in terms of record keeping, and just to give you some insight on why it's a challenge. Now let's talk about best practices. And the way we think about this is we've broken down social media records management to 4 key issues, four aspects of record keeping that are really crucial. And these are, by the way, not completely unique to social media. Some of these make a lot of sense with other types of record keeping, but there are when you bring these 4 together, this is definitely something that becomes very clear that social media has these challenges where other mediums don't. So I'll start with frequency, right? I mentioned again that something like email or SharePoint, it's in your control. So frequency is not a big issue. An email comes in to your IT server, hold on to it. But with Facebook and Twitter, it's out on their servers. And so frequency is all about going out there and getting that information as fast as you can. You have to ask yourself a question of what if I do get an important comment from a citizen and then they delete it? What if something gets edited? Frequency is all about getting ahead of that and capturing the information in real time as it's happening to protect your agency. Second, comprehensiveness. Now this is more like, this is applicable to all forms of content, but with social media, again, I think one of the things that happens is we gloss over the details. If it's very easy to say, oh, we archive Facebook. Well, what does that mean? Do you get the live videos? Do you get the emojis, the stickers, the nested conversations? Do you capturing the photo albums, the private messaging, the reviews, right? There's a lot of information here, and these networks keep changing. So you need to have the details, and you have to remember that your ability to be compliant today, you may be compliant today, but if the network changes tomorrow, you may just instantly fall out of compliance in some regard, and you have to be able to keep up with that. Authenticity is about being able to believe in the records and trust in them. Ultimately, we've talked about these as being as legal situations. A public records request, if it escalates, does tend to turn into a lawsuit where you're challenged. And if it's a legal situation, you want these records, even if it's a tweet or a comment, to serve as legal evidence in court. So your record keeping approach, what does it do to make sure your content's authentic? Again, a lot of you responded back that you would go back and screenshot. And again, that is perfectly reasonable, right? That's the best you can do. But you have to then ask yourself, if I take a bunch of screenshots to court, how admissible are these as legal evidence? What if somebody then challenges them and says, well, that was photoshopped, right? So authenticity comes in here and says, I have a record that I can prove and stand by, and it's admissible as legal evidence. It has not been tampered with or falsified. And that's what we want to get to with our record-keeping approach. And in context, which I think is actually most often overlooked, is acknowledging the fact that it's not just about storing data, but it's about producing it. And when you respond to a records request, can you make sense of it? Can you replay an entire Facebook conversation with 24,000 comments on it, with all of the nested replies? Can you, or with 24 comments on it? Can you replay the Twitter timeline from 3.5 years ago? Can you make sense of that conversation, not just for yourself, but for the person requesting the record? Because the last thing you want is a back and forth, or if you produce something, someone then says you're hiding it because you're hiding information, right? You want to be very clear and complete with your records request. So those are the 4 criteria that we identified in our work in this industry, and really been at the foundation of the work that we do. I do also want to mention that you'll run across, when you look at archiving approaches, record-keeping approaches, various terms. Authentic capture is something that we at least feel that we coined a long time ago about social media. What we found early in the industry was a lot of vendors would take an approach of shortcutting on social media, maybe using a web crawler to capture, or maybe capturing a Facebook conversation and transferring it into email. And again, social media being starting to grow in importance and having these potential legal consequences, this term authentic capture is something that's been our core focus, which is have the exact information untampered with, untranslated. It's the full record from the social network, and you can replay it the way you saw it on the network. Truly authentic. Metadata is again an issue that comes up, and there's some case law around that. So again, a little bit technical there, but if any of you have a question on metadata, happy to dive into it. Preservation of context, again, is remembering that if you have a records request, you can't just produce a comment here and a comment there. Those comments are part of conversations, and you need to be able to produce that whole context of what that conversation was about and so forth. What post was it on? You may need to produce the timeline itself. Continuous archiving speaks to frequency rather than capturing once a day or even every few hours. You want to if the medium generates records in real time, those communications can disappear in real time. You need to get as real time as possible. Again, there are technical limitations in some areas, but getting as real time as possible is really what this is about. Digitally signed records speaks to authenticity. As if you see this as you look at record keeping approaches, when a record is captured, at the moment it's captured, making sure it's digitally signed will prove that authenticity. There's actually standard industry techniques for digitally signing information such that it can be used as electronic legal evidence. Advanced search and filtering. This is really about the needle in the haystack problem. So for all of you who've fulfilled records requests before, you know that when you're looking for something in a vast repository, whether it's your email or now it's social media, it's a needle in the haystack problem. And so what you don't want is to settle for a simple search like you have on Facebook, where it's really hard to get the answer to that records request. You can maybe put in a keyword or two, but if you've ever tried that, you know how difficult it is to find what you want. With any kind of record keeping approach, you need to think about the advanced search and filtering abilities, where you can kind of set out this date range, these types of content, these affecting these accounts. But then when you search for that content, being able to then filter and kind of sift through it, that's what a really good records management approach allows you to do, is really filter through and sift through those records to find what you need. And then last thing here is comprehensive visual and native export. When you look at record keeping approaches, you may have an approach that's really great at storing the data, but when it produces it, it's a bunch of technical gobbledygook, right? It's something that you can make sense of. You need to be able to produce that information in a way that looks just like the social network. You can hand it to somebody and they can make sense of it. So again, speaking of that context and the importance of having both the record, but also any metadata, any relevant content with that record. So for the metadata, I kind of prompted folks to ask questions on this. So if you ask the question, I'll touch on it just at a high level here. This is a tweet that has 126 characters. We actually made this tweet when you could only do 140 characters on Twitter. You can now do 280. But regardless, there's more than 2,000 characters on Twitter when it comes to the electronic record. So if you look under the covers and the metadata, which is the technical records describing this tweet, it has the content. It also has user IDs, location information, timestamps, and there is case law again in multiple states where when folks have challenged whether or not metadata is public record, in both cases, metadata was ruled to be as much as part of the public record as the content itself. So remember that what you see is not necessarily what you get. And when you have electronic record keeping on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or anywhere else, you need the full electronic record, not just what you would get in a screenshot. So I do want to provide just a few approaches here, and I want to talk through some stopgaps because it's really important to understand, well, one, what can you do today? And then two, what do you want to do for the long term? What's really going to protect your agency? And many of you hinted at this when you responded to that poll saying that you would go and do those screenshots. I will tell you that going and doing a screenshot is at least a record. It's better than no record, right? Good to have some kind of record. Now, agencies we work with, before having more robust archiving in place, we've had PIOs that would spend 20 to 30 hours a month, literally when we interviewed them, 20 to 30 hours a month, taking proactive screenshots of their social media. Why? Well, it's the deletion issue, the edit issue, right? So they were taking these screenshots because they didn't know any other way to get those records, but knew that they had to have those records. So screenshotting is an approach, but you probably don't want to do 20 to 30 hours a month to have the records you need to have. And even if you're just taking a reactive stance, if you're just screenshotting controversial issues or situations you're concerned about, over time that adds up, and you have to ask yourself, how are you going to organize it? How are you going to find what you need? How do you search screenshots? If you go to court and they are disputed, to my point about authenticity, how good of a record was that in the first place? Especially if you spent 30 hours a month keeping those records, and then you go to court and someone says, well, there's no authenticity of this record. How do we can't trust it. You've wasted your effort. So again, it is a solution. If you're not doing anything and you're in a hairy circumstance, take a quick screenshot, but immediately think about proper record keeping, how to have a complete record that you can stand by, search, and produce for the long term. Now, on that note, we're in an industry where there's all sorts of content. There's email, there's text, there's websites, there's so many different forms of content. It's really great. There's so many ways for us to share information and communicate, but from a records management standpoint, you have to deal with all of them. And it's very tempting to say, well, let's just go find something that does it all, right? And that really is kind of a dream situation, I think, for all of us. But we have to remember that an email is so different from a Facebook conversation with live video in it. So different from a static website that you manage yourself versus a forum that citizens can comment on, edit, and delete. And so when you look at solutions, you may find various combinations. I would encourage you to evaluate different solutions. But you have to kind of go content type by content type. What we tend to see happen is certain content types get treated as first class in an archive, and then other content types are second class. And so while you might have it all in one place, make sure that whatever approach you take, that if you're keeping email records, you're keeping them the way you need to, and they're complete, and they're authentic, and you can produce them. If you're keeping social media records, they're complete, they're authentic, they're reconstructible, they're producible. Do not trade off the fidelity of your records, your ability to respond to records requests, for the perceived convenience of having it in one system, because we have had many agencies that had legacy systems that when they had that records request for social media were dead in the water. They tried to produce a records request for social media across many conversations, and they received an Excel file that couldn't even make sense of, right? So you have to think about how to keep the best record possible, and then see if you can bring it together. And to date with the industry, because of how different these content types are, you really do have to kind of take a piecemeal approach. But again, it's an approach for you to consider. If you have a system, you could look at it as a temporary stopgap, that maybe some partial amounts of your social media record keeping can happen there until you figure out a strategy for social media. Now, I'm going to wrap up here by laying something out that when it comes to record keeping, I strongly encourage you to value the records that are being generated on social media, to immediately think about what's the first step you can take, and that starts with your policy, and it takes you to technology. But remember that this is a very difficult problem. You want to find a way to make this easy for you. At the end of the day, social networks are not made for archiving. Facebook does not have a built-in one-stop shop that we all go to get all of your data. So when you look at record-keeping approaches, every approach out there does the best it can, or has different approaches, has a different approach to trying to get your data. And you want to find the approach that does the best it possibly can to get you in compliance. And you want an approach that understands social media, that when the network changes, it changes too, so that it can keep up with the new types of records that are being generated. So it's really critical when you think about social media compliance that it's not an on-off switch. You have to be as compliant as possible. Inherently, we're dependent on Facebook and Twitter, who do not have built-in compliance. So you can't be 100%, but you want to get as close as possible to protect your agency. And be really wary of the details, things like Facebook Live, the various channels on Facebook, Facebook events, Facebook reviews. There are numerous channels by which agencies are communicating, and a lot of records are being generated. And it's not as simple as just saying, hey, we archive Facebook and calling it done. You really want to be aware of, to the extent you're covered, and make sure you're finding the approach that gets you as covered as possible, so that when you receive that records request, no problem, you're able to produce it. So what does that approach look like? Well, let's get the frequency up. Let's get it as real time as possible. So near real time is what you'll find in the industry, the best you can possibly do. By the way, this is not every 30 minutes. This is within seconds or minutes capturing data from the networks. Comprehensiveness, you absolutely need to have the metadata, as I showed in that example of the tweet. You also need a solution that keeps up with the social network. As they change, it is on top of these changes. It is handling all of the intricacies, because the devil is in the details. Authenticity, you need a solution that will prove the authenticity, so that when you have these records, you can use them in a legal context. And speaking of context, you need context. So ultimately, a archiving solution or a record keeping approach needs to be judged by your ability to respond to records requests. If you evaluate a solution, understand what the response to a records request looks like. Go through a simulated records request. Ask whoever you're talking to do that for you, and see how would you produce your social media content in a records request situation in a way that makes sense and would protect your agency. We actually had an agency in Colorado just a few months ago receive a records request for 14 different keywords related to drilling across the entire social media presence. Just imagine that records request: 14 different keywords across the entire social media presence, and they have certainly an interesting social media presence. It's not a very basic one. It's built out. And when you find that, let's just say first you have to find all that, and you need a solution that finds it instantly, really, to save you some time. But you find it all, and you need to give it to somebody. You've got hundreds of posts and comments across many different conversations. There may be 15 comments that are throughout those search results that are actually part of the same conversation. And what you want to do is be able to bring that all together, bring those 15 comments back together in that one conversation. If there's another comment that's kind of a lone wolf, you still want to bring all the other comments around it back so you can make sense of it. So you need a solution that really understands social media and gets that context out so that you're responding to this records request, 14 different keywords across the entire social media presence. You have a PDF that lays it out. Here's a conversation on social media that had 3 matches, and here's what they were. Here's a conversation on social media that had 15 matches. Here's what they were, right? It does that in a way that just has all the context. That is critical for preventing the back and forth, the confusion, and the risk that can come out of these situations. So I'm going to, actually, I wanted to, why don't we wrap up here, Stephanie, if that's okay with you, and just close out, because I want to stop presenting. I know I've shared a lot of information, hopefully valuable to you all, but with the remaining time, focus on questions. So let me take the takeaways real quick here. And what we love to do, again, is channel the industry. And so we'll actually give you the takeaways from real people in your shoes. So to the point of social media being vital to your agency's communications, Norma Ali says it best out of Palmer. She says it's moved out of the phase of being trendy, right? It's moved into being a necessity, a core part of the community's communication strategy. Again, this question of what would happen if social media disappeared tomorrow. Number 2, your social media creates public records. As Mary Ellen Dunn says out of Clarksdale, our social media is subject to public records law. We are required to produce social media records, including deleted comments in the event of a records request. We are required to produce whatever has been created. And as many of you know, it's all about creation. At the moment something is created, it becomes a public record or not. Later, if it gets deleted, you can't just wipe your hands of it and say, well, it's not there. The time it was created, it becomes a public record. And as an agency, you need to have done your diligence to retain those records to the best of your ability to be able to produce it when requested. And 3, have a plan, right? Have a plan, the policies, have a plan to archive. Don't wait. Start archiving your social media sooner than later. It'll protect your agency. Again, from a public records request or just negative attention, we've seen this time and time again, is that you could have the sleepiest social media presence, but the way social media works, suddenly you're not the type of town that has to deal with this until you're the type of town that's dealing with it. And so that is the reality. Now, we do want to make this easy as possible. That's the conversation out of here, but we do want to offer one thing to you, which is a lot of folks go, well, what does a social media archive even look like? What do you mean things get edited or deleted? So we actually have this free capability on our website that you can try out. It takes less than 60 seconds with your Twitter account, if you have a Twitter account. Connect your Twitter account, 60 seconds, literally you have a countdown from 60 to 0 where we build an archive, and you literally get to see what a social media archive looks like for you. You can add Facebook, YouTube, whatever else, and then over the course of a few weeks, you can see how much is getting edited or deleted. So a really neat tool to show you how you can archive and give you some insights into what's happening on your social media. Okay, so I'm going to pause now for questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Anil. That was fantastic. We still do have quite a few questions here, and I know they're kind of spanning the whole length of the presentation, so some are going back to previous things we talked about. But one we have here is, how does Archive Social guarantee that they have captured every third-party comment, including posts that are immediately deleted?
As you saw on my slide, we are reliant, whether it's Archive Social or anybody else, we're reliant on getting this data off of Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. And that mere fact that we have to get it off for that third party means that nobody can guarantee 100%. You just can't. Now, what you can do, though, is do the best you possibly can to get as much data as you can, as frequently as you can, as comprehensively as you can. And so, at least our approach, and this is what you should look for as you evaluate solutions, is how do you, what is your approach, what is your proven track record, frankly, of staying on top of the social networks changes, of capturing deletions? Can you show me how you've captured deletions in an archive seconds after a post happened, it was deleted 30 seconds later? Show me a deletion that you caught in those 30 seconds. Live video. Show me a situation where you captured live video and play it back for me. Like, these are the questions you should ask us and everybody else that does this in the industry, and you will get different answers, right? Because it's such a hard problem. We specialize in this particularly. All we do is social media archiving for government. So again, we're very much into the details, but the best that you can do is get as compliant as possible. I'm very proud to say that when our customers have records requests, they're able to respond to them, right? And that's the ultimate test. So whatever solution you look at, the evidence of records requests being fulfilled, and then you can actually ask some of those specific questions that I outlined about content being deleted or some of those intricacies of the social network.
Okay, great. So another question we have is, what if our staff posts something that is on their individual account? Is that subject to an open records request?
Actually, I wanted to add something to the last response. I do want to make sure everyone here has a picture in mind that risk and compliance are not like an on-off switch either. So when we talk about not 100%, you also don't want to be as close to zero as possible. And so when it comes to risk, there's always risk. It's just a matter of how do you close that risk as much as possible. So transitioning into this question, how do you close this risk? Well, if somebody conducts public business on their private page, the best practice we've seen is to lay out in your policy employee use guidelines. And in the employee use guidelines, you say, you're permitted to have your own social media pages for your personal use, but if you're going to conduct public business, it must happen on a sanctioned public page. We do have this social media in our social media policy template. We can share this with you. And as an agency, to protect yourself, laying out the rules of the road for your employees to say, you cannot conduct public business in these private forums, because it is true. Like, if you allowed it, then you basically just need to archive their accounts too. But people don't want you archiving their personal private Facebook pages, right? So you have to draw that line. Just like a lot of people carry around two phones, right? Use this phone for your personal, and you have your personal phone, but use this phone for government work. The same thing with social media. You got to lay out that policy at a minimum.
Okay, great. Another question about retention periods, and this one is specific to our software. So, is there a retention period for social media posts, which I know we've kind of already talked about, and how does Archive Social deal with the deletions of records with regards to retention periods?
So one thing about deletions is, again, capturing in near real time. We have to, in order to have records of something that's been deleted, you need to capture before it's deleted. So we deal with it first by capturing in near real time to the extent possible in each network to capture the data before it gets deleted. When it gets deleted, it actually gets flagged and tagged in our archive. You can actually search for deleted records anytime across all social networks. And then when it comes to retention, you can then choose how you want to deal with this. You may choose to create a retention policy that disposes of content that's been deleted. You can do that with our system. You can just choose to have a retention policy that has a fixed retention period for any content that you have decided to tag as a citizen complaint or related to a certain topic. So you have the ability to set up a disposition on whatever you want on the content of the record. We do also support more of those blanket policies. So if you decide that you want to have a blanket retention period for your police department and it's 3 years, you can do that too. So everything in those accounts will have retention for 3 years, then can be disposed after 3 years. You can even set a blanket retention for your entire archive. We have agencies really use all those facilities. But at the end of the day, it's really up to your own particular use cases. All of what government needs to do, though, is supported. And I will reemphasize that most agencies tend to actually retain the records indefinitely for various reasons, including just legal protection over time, because the content, even if you dispose of it, could be out there somewhere else.
Okay, great. Some kind of specific questions about specific instances and what people should do. I think they're looking for your thoughts on that. So one specific one is, what if somebody Facebook Lives a meeting to their private Facebook account? How would we keep track of that?
Well, I think if a citizen is recording a meeting, they're not communicating that on your behalf. And so, again, there hasn't been a tremendous amount of case law or evaluation of this, and I would defer to the records bodies ultimately. But from the work that we do, it really comes down to what you're communicating, sent or received. Now, if they Facebook Live it and put it on your page, they've communicated this message to you, and right, and you can kind of decide how to deal with it. You likely want to keep that record. But if somebody decides to communicate something on your behalf with, again, recording the meeting and posting it out there, not through your channel, you haven't communicated that out. And what we tend to do is go through the analogy of social media to more traditional forms. I'm really just talking on the fly here because this is a good question. I haven't heard this one before. I don't know if it's akin to somebody kind of showing up in a government meeting and then writing down what was said in an email and then sending out that email to their friends. Well, you didn't communicate that out. So I think that was probably the best analogy there. Instead of them sending the contents of that meeting out in an email on their own behalf by themselves, now they're just putting it in a Facebook post or a Facebook video. The same rules apply. You're not responsible for keeping records of their email that they're sending out on their own accord that was not communicated by the agency.
Okay, great. This is kind of building on a previous question. So somebody asks, another person asked, if somebody posts on a personal account, is it subject to public records request? Well, said to lay out the rule. You said to lay out the rules and tell them not to do it, but what if they do it anyway? Is it subject to a public records request?
Well, and you've seen the case law, I'm sure, with email where particularly public officials get challenged on, well, were you conducting public business in this private email account? And those challenges will happen, right? So they can do it anyway, and it's really in your shoes as someone that either defines or plays a heavy role in the definition of policy and the record keeping. The best you can do, right, is to say these are the rules of the road. Here's how we have to keep records. Here's how we're going to do it. We are keeping records. We do have a comment moderation. We're doing all this stuff. And then if somebody breaks the rules, at least you can draw a line to say, look, the agency is doing everything we can, and separate yourself from that individual. Now, I know that's not a perfect answer, but that's when we look around the industry, and really, and this is not just in government, really in any situation in a company. In a company, we set employee rules because we wanted to say this is what the stance of the company is, this is what the stance of the agency is. Somebody can always go rogue, but at least you can point to what you did to prevent it and what you did to set the groundwork, and then the responsibility can most really ideally just fall on them, the person that broke the rules.
Okay, great. We have a few questions about our particular product and how much it costs and how people can get information about that.
Well, and we'd love to have that conversation. And Stephanie, you have a couple of slides to wrap up. We'll definitely get our contact information out. We're available on the web at archivesocial.com. But I think probably the best thing is we not only, we like to talk about ourselves, but also if you have questions about some of the content I shared today, one of the first conversations that we have is not about us, it's about this issue. And so just like you heard today, we have more case studies. And so if you're in a particular state and you're wondering, well, what's happened in my state, definitely you go to our website and request a meeting with us, and we'll take one of our consultants to sit down with you, talk about the issues in your state, level set, and talk about you and your problems and how what needs to be solved first. We're really happy to do that. And of course, if you're interested in learning more about us, we'll then talk to you about us as well.
Great. If anybody has any other questions before we wrap up, we're definitely getting a lot of questions about whether you'll get the presentation afterwards, and you will. And then we also have some good links that we'll share with you with regards to that flow chart Neil shared earlier with the Wake County social media policy, and also some social media policy templates. So just kind of some follow-up information with regards to the continuing education credit for IIMC. We will send out the quiz in a follow-up email later today, so you can keep an eye out for that. And then we just ask that you complete the quiz. It's only 4 questions, so not too long, just by next Thursday, March 22nd. And the certificate will then be mailed back out to you to show that you've completed it. So that's kind of how that process will go. And if you have any more questions, you can feel free to contact Neil. There's his email right there. And I think that's it. Thanks so much, Neil, for this conversation today. It was great.
Well, thank you, and thank you all again on the line. Those of you who listened in, those of you who submitted questions, answered the polls. We really appreciate this opportunity to be a part of this industry. And as Stephanie said, that is my email address. So if I can be a resource to you, feel free to email me. And with us wrapping up here, best of luck with your social media and your social media policy and your archiving.